Hello, everyone, for joining us in middle of the day here. Something we're doing a little bit different from some of our FAA safety team events. To be honest, when we did this, one of the questions was, would it be a great day to do this in Michigan because the weather many times doesn't allow us? I think it turned out to be a little bit better flying day than originally thought, and hopefully some folks are out there flying, but those of you who have joined us, glad to have you here. And we're going to talk today about some of the training documentation hiccups that many times stop a check ride before it happens. This event's being hosted by the FAA safety team. Certainly appreciate them. We've got a couple of the folks on board with us today to help out. Pat Ryan's with us from the Detroit office, along with Zach. I think you're in here too, right? Somewhere. And I think everybody should have the ability as we go through this today to ask questions. The webinar chat should be open to even have open mics if you want. So if you do have questions, feel free as we go through. We're going to try to make this a little bit of a discussion, and I'm going to dig deep into a few things we regularly see as examiners and some of the things we're seeing out in the industry that hopefully if you're an applicant going to a check ride, or certainly if you're a CFI preparing people, you can help avoid to make sure your students get to do the check ride. They don't get to the day of and have to be told by that examiner that they're going home without doing it, because that wastes a lot of time for everybody. Quick note here, we are actually going to record this session. I'm actually recording it, so I'll make it available for folks that didn't make it. If you have anybody that you know of CFI or students that need this information, get in touch with me, and I will probably be putting up available on my website so folks can learn from this beyond what we do just in person today. So appreciate everybody being here. Looking forward to the interaction. And I guess let's start with a little bit of information. What we're finding is there's actually lots of practical tests that continue to be unable to even begin, to not start, due to missing experience or documentation. Certainly, those in the training industry are noticing this, and the FAA has been noticing this continues to delay practical testing flow throughout the national airspace system. Certainly a concern that lots of people have been having, right? We're trying to get check rides through. Everybody wants to get them done, and the examiners are backed up. So one of the challenges for that is making sure when we do have somebody going to a check ride that they're able to proceed with that, and those are not wasted practical test slots. Some estimates, this came out of some FAA data and certainly some industry association data, are that we're actually seeing about 30% of the practical tests not able to start because of these things. The good news is there's some things we can do to make sure that they do proceed forward and don't delay that certification process for everybody trying to get these done. This gets especially true in the months where the weather's tough to get a check ride in, and super frustrating when you show up on that beautiful weather day in January, the first one that you've had maybe in weeks, and something stops it from going forward. So let's talk a little bit more about some of these. Not too long ago, the FAA actually highlighted this concern in a 2024 article in the FAA safety briefing, where we talked about how maybe anywhere up to 40 or 50,000 practical tests were ended before they even started. So ended is kind of the wrong word. They didn't even begin. We're trying to qualify the applicant and moving forward. So we're missing endorsements, lacking aeronautical experience, having application errors, aircraft airworthiness. All of these things bring about a pretty big glaring backlog, and sometimes weeks and months, for that much anticipated practical test. So this is not something that is just happening this year. It's been happening for a while, and it is something we can work on. Not too long ago, the FAA even put out another notice on this. This is back in this August about CFIs and DPEs to avoid certification delays. This one specifically was related to mismatches of identification information, primarily not having names that match. We see this a lot of times, whether the IACRA app doesn't match what's on the photo ID, or the knowledge test, or the medical. So if you are working with applicants, make sure we are using consistent naming nomenclature in this. So it should be first name, middle name, last name. If we do have multiple middle names, the FAA generally asks the individual to pick one of the two that they're going to be using and stick with that along the way. I'll tell you, I see this actually a lot on medicals, where we have somebody does their first medical, they go in to MedExpress, they put their first name, last name, or they put a middle initial. that AME doesn't necessarily know that that's not what they want. And then, the CFI goes and gets them a student pilot certificate. It's got first name, middle name, last name. And maybe they go do their knowledge test and they just put first name, last name on. All of these things don't match. And if that shows up to the practical test, we are not going to be able to proceed forward. So this is actually a really big duty of the CFIs. When you are sitting down with your students and helping them get that first medical, get that first student pilot certificate, make sure you know that we're going to have to put the same things on, first name, middle name, last name, and have a photo ID that matches that. So right from the beginning, the FAA is noticing that this is something that generates longer term consequences in the practical testing process to get them through. And a lot of times this doesn't get caught until the day of the test. So, do a little diligence on this. I will say, even make sure what comes out on their student pilot certificate is correct. I had one a couple of weeks ago that we had first name, middle initial, last name on the student pilot certificate. And when I'll say that, it was even an abbreviated first name. So it was, a shortened version of the first name, middle initial, last name. And that didn't match what was on the knowledge test. The challenge was when we went back and looked, actually the temp cert that they had issued and the knowledge test all had first name, full spelled out, full middle name, full last name, and somehow it had actually come out of Airman Certification Office with some abbreviations in it. So when your students get that plastic in the mail, make sure it matches what came to them, matches what was actually put on the forms that went out and what's going to be used forward. So check those name mismatches as you go through. As we dig forward, some of the big common areas that we see challenges on, maintenance records are a big thing that we see, not only just lack of understanding for the applicants on this, but also just the inability of the aircraft to be qualified as airworthy for the practical test. Sometimes we don't even have all the logbooks show there. We're missing AD compliance. Might find that there is overdue aircraft maintenance, and certainly that means we're not going to be able to proceed with the test. This is all stuff that really should be caught well ahead of the practical test. There should be no surprise on the day of the test that the aircraft logbooks or the aircraft itself is unairworthy. And this is something you can communicate with the examiner with, but it means the instructor and the student probably need to take the time a day ahead or even a couple days ahead to go through these logbooks, make sure everything's good to go. Certainly, hopefully you've looked through those logbooks well ahead, taught the students this stuff, but a last check a couple days out is going to make sure that any changes since the last time you've seen that aircraft could be addressed and potentially rescheduled if it comes up. It's also going to help your students better understand how to answer questions on those maintenance logs and the questions regarding airworthiness on the practical test. Mechanical problems is certainly something that comes up too. I'm going to show you a couple pictures here in a second that should make you kind of cringe. We understand as an examiner if the aircraft is flying prior to the test, the day before, even the night before, or that morning if you got an afternoon practical test, and something breaks. Aircraft that's found with obvious mechanical issues is going to cause a check ride to be stopped. If there are known issues that have been there for days and weeks and you just haven't bothered to tell the examiner that, that's going to be a bigger challenge. So take the time to know if the airplane is going to be airworthy. If you have questions, find the owner of the aircraft. If it's not you, work through it, work through the maintenance shop, and determine if there is an actual problem with the airworthiness of that aircraft. Hopefully it hasn't been flying that way, but sometimes those things are found, and we don't want it to be on the day of the practical test. When we come to the applicant issues, there's a lot of times we're finding missing or incomplete paperwork. We have to, as examiners, go through and verify that the applicant has all of the required experience, documents, paperwork has to be there. And our job is to make sure the applicant is qualified for the test for which we are giving. If we cannot verify that, doesn't always even mean that the applicant has not completed that experience. But if we can't find it, you can't show it to us, you can't show us the documentation of it, we may not be able to proceed. It doesn't mean the applicant got a discontinuance or a failure or anything. It just means we did not start the test. So many times we do find things that are actually missing in experience, but also a lot of times we simply find it's not able to be presented in a viewable form. We have incomplete logging entries for experience, whether it's ground or flight training. And it means that the CFI is going to have to go back and either present some of that documentation, clarify it, or in the cases of missing experience, the applicant may have to redo or refly some experience requirements or complete things that were not completed. Paperwork's a big part of the job as a CFI. You got to make sure you get all of this stuff right. And some of this is for the purpose of the Checkride, but I also would offer the thought that this is also for you as the CFI are the certifying agent that pilot's training has been completed. As an examiner, I literally just show up and I'm kind of a check on the system to make sure, but really when you give all of those endorsements and sign-offs, you are the one stating that applicant met the requirements, has all of the experience done, has all the documentation, and not trying to scare anybody, but I'll generally tell people I'm a little afraid of the FAA. I'm a lot afraid of that civil attorney. So, if something gets missed and we don't have it documented and there is, God forbid, a tragic accident later, and they come back and audit that pilot's training information, do you have what you need to show that everything was done properly? What you do to make that happen is also going to generally make the FAA qualification process for the practical test one that is successful. So these are kind of the big areas. We're going to talk about some specific examples as we go through this stuff today and poke at some stuff to get us thinking. But I love showing pictures too. So we start with this fun picture. This was an airplane that obviously had a bald spot on a tire. Now, I think those in Michigan can see the where this was. The good news is this airplane was not on the line flying. This had happened in the course of a lesson. But I will tell you, we've seen many times pictures like this, or we've shown up at check rides where an applicant will find this on the pre-flight and the examiner will say, "What do you think? Are we good to go?" And they'll say, "Yep, I think we're good." I think certainly everybody who's on this today, especially CFIs, will look at this and go, "Wow, I would hope my student wouldn't say we have an airworthy aircraft." This aircraft tire obviously got to go to maintenance and got fixed, but it was a good example of things you might find on a pre-flight. Now, this one, on the other hand, was actually sent to me by another examiner, and this was during the pre-flight for a commercial check ride. The examiner queried a little bit. "What do you think? Are we good to go?" And the applicant said, "Yeah, we're good and airworthy with this going on." And so when the examiner queried a little more and said, "Well, what about this?" The answer he got was, "Well, it's been flying this way. It seems fine." So where's the gut check on whether this is airworthy, and what was the school teaching that student about flying that aircraft with those conditions? Certainly a tough thing to try and find on a check ride there. And one more fun example for you. This is actually the corner in a Cessna 172. And while I'm not going to play the video, this is actually a snap out of a video for you. You can actually push that corner out there in the upper right corner. And this was during the taxi out. And the applicant, again, confirmed to the examiner, "We're good to go. Let's get this check ride done." So these are things we're actually seeing that are out in the systems. When we say we're seeing maintenance issues on airplanes, sometimes it's not really small, nitpicky stuff. It's really kind of big stuff that should be pretty obvious with these airplanes still flying. If you're a CFI and you have a flight training operation that's asking you to fly airplanes this way, please say no. If you have operators that are pushing you to do it, reach out to our FAA safety team folks and have them engage, and we can help with some corrective learning, hopefully, before something like this would turn into a more tragic situation. So let's dig into some of the examples on common experience requirements that end up stopping check rides from beginning. There's a lot of regulatory things that we run into, and I know it's hard as a CFI to try and learn everything, every little picky detail, and that's what we're all out here for as resources. Use each other, use folks like me. If you have questions before you send a student to an examiner, give that examiner a call and ask questions. We would much rather find those questions, answers prior to the day of the test, because we might be able to solve them with a little bit of work ahead. So digging in, one of the really common things we see missing is that ground training. So all of the initial certificates do require actual logged ground training. I say that carefully. We're pretty good usually as CFIs at logging the flight training, what we went out, how much time we flew, where we went, things like that. But we're not always that great about logging the ground training. And the reg's pretty specific on this, on all of them. It says must have received and logged ground training from an authorized instructor. This means that you have to log what you did with the student and meet specific requirements. So you see in this slide, we've got the initial private pilot, the regs that do at 105 and 107. The instrument's got 61, 65 requirements. And then for the commercial and the CFI, we've got 125, 127, 185, and 187. All of these dictate that we do need to log ground training. Now, it gets a little more specific than this. If we dig into each of these, for example, in this case, here is the private. The question becomes, what do we have to log? So each of these certificates has specific requirements listed out. And in 105 and 107, you can see here we have, we'll take a look at 107 in the middle. For areas of operation, the instructor has to log ground training in pre-flight, the list here, ground reference, maneuvers, navigation, night ops, all of these things. So what we're looking for as the examiners, we have to see somewhere during your training record. It doesn't necessarily have to be in the logbook. It could be logged somewhere that's provided part of your training record for that student, that they have training in each of these specific areas. Now, I will admit wholeheartedly, if these were the only areas of training that an instructor gave a student for their private, they probably wouldn't pass their knowledge test or the practical test. But these are the specific ones that are dragged out in the regs that we have to see coverage of. I'll also admit the regs do not say how much coverage, how much time, how frequent, how long ago. So we just need to see that it's there. A good CFI is certainly going to provide, adequate instruction on all these there. There might be multiple training events on the ground where you cover this. There might be homework. You might send your student some FAA safety team courses to take that cover some of this material. But then you're going to come back and review this and create a log and make sure that the student has all of these things logged. Now, we gave the private example here, but you can find the same thing in all of the regulations going back for the commercial, the instrument, the CFI also. This is not required for an add-on rating. So while ground might be certainly applicable if somebody is adding on a private pilot multi-engine certificate, or they have a commercial single-engine certificate and they're adding on their multi, it is not necessarily required for the add-on certificates to demonstrate that ground training has been logged. So we're not going to be looking for that as an examiner, but we are for the initial certificates. Many times this brings the questions of what do I actually have to log then? And the CFIs should dig into this. In 6151, we do have some regulations that tell us what we have to do when we log ground training. So we have to say how much time we did, what was covered, and then we've got to do the endorsement like we do every other spot with our the CFI name, the number, the expiration date, or the recency of occurrency now, and make sure that's legible. And so that's got to be in there for every time we do one of these ground training logs. So this is really commonly missed. And unfortunately, a lot of times when we show up to do a practical test, we're just flat missing it. And then we're trying to find if the CFI happens to be there. Can they go back in their records and document this? Can they find it where they did it? Or do they just have to recreate all of this? And many times that means the test is not going to go forward on that day. So spend some time ahead of time if you're a CFI working on ground with your student to make sure you've got it documented. We at least meet the minimums. There's a few checklists out there. Might even be one on my website for each of these that you can use. That's the bare minimum. So at least covers the areas that you can use to make sure you've got something to present. It's a little bit different when you get into the 141 programs. Typically, they're operating out of a TCO, and the completion of all of those lessons and the documentation of it will typically supplement this recording requirement through the issuance of a grad certificate. So we do get a little bit lucky when we're doing check rides in those programs that we've got another way to kind of hang our hat on that logging. But if you're doing the training, just regular old 61 training, you're going to have to put this log together some way. I'll tell you what I personally do is I actually just have a Google sheet when I work with my own students, and every time I do some ground with them, I just create a list. I actually kind of write up a little summary of what we covered, and then in the end, I create a PDF of that and send it to the examiner when I send my own students. Just some way that you have a way to track what was covered, who did it, what date it was done, how much time you spent, and then put your instructor endorsement on there with that. Many times we run into the question of, does doing an online ground school meet this requirement? And the answer to that is, well, kind of, it depends. And the reason it depends is it depends on what that online ground school has put on their graduation certificate. Many of the grad certs have transitioned to putting a clause in there, and you can see it on this one where it says has met the minimum requirements set forth by 61-105. So that doesn't cover the 107 section. So you have to look closely at the language. Depending on the certificate a student presents, I may or may not be able to proceed with that being something that covers the ground portion of a test. Here's another example from Sporties. In this case, it says specifically their ground course is done in preparation for the airplane knowledge test. So that kind of boxes us out of using that as the preparation for the ground for the practical test. Another example here, Gold Seal Online. Both these are great ground schools, Sporties, ASA, Gleim, Kings, all of these do a good job, but they do put notes in here sometimes that kind of box us into a regulatory requirement. So if your student's planning on doing that, make sure you dig in deep and see what's in there. If nothing else, they might be great, kind of reviews for your students if that's the way they're doing some of their ground school, but it may or may not meet those requirements. And here's an example of just what a ground log might look like. So in this case, we've got 61-105. We've got sheets like this for the 107 and 129 stuff all there to your 27, 25, where you might just have the CFI date, the ground covered, and the amount of time, and then each of those. So as long as all of those areas are somehow covered, that's going to meet the requirements for getting us the required ground training that must be logged for training. I've kind of beat that to death for you guys, but I think you get the gist. Make sure ground training is covered, or we're probably not going to be able to proceed with the test as an examiner. All right, let's dig into some other fun stuff here. So we have the long private pilot cross country. And this is what we regularly refer to as the bad triangle. Okay, so in this case, we started at FLO, Florence Regional, that nice Class Delta airport in the middle. They proceeded to CDN, which is over kind of on the left there, Woodward, and then over to Lumberton and back. And what we look at a lot of times is instructors will look at the requirements in the 61-109, the experience requirements, and it'll say a student must fly at least 150-mile cross country with a leg that is more than 50 miles in length. And in this case, we can look at the nav log here. We've got the first leg's 42, the second one's 77. We got a 41 mile, and the last one's 160. So we have 150 miles. We got a leg that's more than 50 in the air. And that one specifically says a leg of more than 50 miles. Now, the challenge is what this fails to additionally qualify is that under 61.1, we have a regulatory requirement that says for the purposes of experience towards a rating or certificate, the pilot must have flown to a point with a landing more than 50 miles away from the point of origin. So that's why we call this the bad triangle. In this case, the Florence to Woodward leg is certainly under 50, and that LBT back to FLO leg is under 50. Even though we have more than 150 miles, we don't have a place that was a landing that was more than 50 miles away from where they began. Now, challengingly and frustratingly, had the pilot done this exact same flight and started either over at Lumberton or Woodward and flown the triangle the other way, this would actually count because then their starting point and one of their points are more than 50 miles away. So watch this with your students. Make sure when you set up those cross-country requirements that they do meet all of the requirements, the regulation that they're certifying under, and the broad definition of what counts as a long cross-country, or as a cross-country flight for the purposes of rating or certificate. So let's throw a little wrench in this. Here's the next one. And while you guys are looking at this, I'm going to take a quick drink, process this just a little bit. Okay, so we got 4 landing points in this one, right? I will tell you in this case, because of where they started, they do have a point of landing that's more than 50 miles away from where they began. But they have 4 landing points in. They got a leg that's more than 50. They certainly did more than 150 miles. And then we run into a little bit of a wrench that we found on this one. So if we look at the regulation specifically, we have 10 hours of solo cross-country flight time, a single-engine airplane that consists of at least 1 solo cross-country flight of 150 miles. So I put a red mark there with the comma because from the English language standpoint, we're going to get technical here, that is what applies to at least 1 solo cross-country. After the comma is qualifiers for that phrase. So it's not applying in there, okay? It says with full stop landings at 3 points. Okay. In this case, we went to 4 points. And I know this is frustrating, but technically that doesn't meet the regulation. We've got an interpretation from years ago, and this is where it's going to get interesting. Old Keller interpretation that said at a minimum of 3 points. So this was back in 2009. The regulation used to say at a minimum of 3 points. It no longer says that. It now says at 3 points with full stop landings, right? So if we dig this really carefully, it really comes down to a comma, which is kind of frustrating because that comma means that landing at 4 points may actually make that cross country no longer count. Now, a good strategic examiner might ask an interesting question at this point, and they might ask, so at one of those points, say, for example, maybe one of these bottom points at Woodward or Florence, did you perhaps do a touch and go? Because the regulation says 3 full stop landings. And if you did a touch and go at one of those, that's not a full stop. And maybe if you answer that correctly, that's a way to continue with the test. But the point here is do what the regulation says. Don't try and get creative and do something else. You don't have to do more when these regulations are highly specific. Do what they say to make sure your student don't have these get boxed out on you. So let's take a look at an IFR cross country. And this was one that I've actually used in a couple of CFII practical tests. So some folks who see this may even recognize this. This was a real cross country that I had somebody present on their practical test qualification portion. So in this case, they flew from Saginaw, MBS, up to Manistee. At Manistee, they shot an ILS. They landed. So, we've got a distance here of 103 miles. They went more than 50 miles, so we're getting cross country. We like that. They went down to Nenu. They did a hold. They flew the RNAV 14 at Muskegon. They went missed. They went over to Alma. And then they flew VFR back to Saginaw. Okay? So the challenge is when we look at that one, the regulation says that you must have an approach at each of the airports that you did on your long IFR cross country. In this case, because they went from Alma back to Mount Pleasant and flew a VFR approach back into Saginaw, into Saginaw, they're not Mount Pleasant, that actually no longer meets the requirements for the long IFR cross country. The other challenge we run into is we see it's 271 miles. So even if they had stopped at Alma, landed there, completed the flight, and then had a separate flight back from there to Saginaw, that actually would have put that flight under the 250-mile requirement then. So in either case, there wasn't a way to make that cross-country count for their long IFR instrument rating qualifying cross-country. Super frustrating because the instructor and student had gone out and flown this, and it doesn't count. It counts as general cross-country time. It's great instrument experience. I'm sure learning was great, but they did have to go out and refly a new instrument qualifying cross-country flight. So we dig into the commercial one, and these, friends, they're some of the toughest ones. These are probably the ones that we as examiners turn more people away from practical tests on for confusion than any other ones. And I would tell you in my life, it's probably 10 or 15% of the practical tests that are done outside the 141 environment actually run into challenges here. And many of those challenges run into the requirements about Section 4 under 129, the 10 hours of, it says, solo flight time in this case, single engine airplane. You could be doing it in a multi. That includes the long cross country, has that 5 hours of night, and then the 20 hours of dual training. So it's always important to remember when we have a regulation, your 61-129, having done requirements for previous ratings under those, whether it's 61-65 or 61-109, does not necessarily make it meet the requirements for the specific experience requirements required for the commercial certificate. So just because you did a long cross country in your private doesn't mean you can do it and use that same one for your commercial. Those are separate regulations, and you have to have that actually specifically done towards that rating or certificate, in this case, the commercial. That solo flight time under Part 4 there includes the solo long cross country, because solo applies to that, and the 5 hours of nighttime. And we do have a legal interpretation on this that you cannot mix and match. The biggest problem we run into on this is many people misunderstand where it says DPIC in here. The duties of pilot and command. That is not acting as PIC while having an instructor provide instruction. That is only if an instructor rode with and you are the DPIC and the instructor is not providing training on that flight. You are not receiving training, logging it as instruction received. So, and it would be inclusive of all of those 10 hours. I'm going to give you the best advice I can in the single engine land. Just go out and do this 10 hours solo by yourself. Solo means you are the sole occupant of the airplane. You are not receiving instruction during that. You are the one flying. Now, if the examiner doesn't know that Aunt Gertrude took the ride with you, we don't know what we don't know, right? But please don't put in the logbook, had a friend take the ride with me. Technically, solo is solo. It's not just you acting as PIC. And what that means is your instructor isn't going to ride along for that long cross country and get that cross country time. And it means you're going to go do that on your own. And it also means you got to stay up late at night, especially during the summer, to go do those 5 hours of nighttime with the 10 takeoffs and landings at a controlled airport that is operating. So that 10 hours really is intended for you to do it on your own. We do have some programs that do this DPIC, especially in the multi, where the instructor will ride with for all 10 of those hours. It can be done that way, but if you do that, make sure you're very careful. It's not instruction received, and it must be logged properly. We look at the Section 3 in there. These are the dual flight training requirements that have to be met for that commercial. Now, some of this is a little bit legacy language. There's 10 hours of instrument training. It says using a view limiting device that covers some specific things here. 5 of that has to be in an airplane, so 5 could be in a sim. Now, this does not say having an instrument rating meets these requirements. It means you have to have 10 hours of instrument training specifically towards 61-127 here requirements and Part 129. So that means you have to have 10 hours of instrument training that was not training that was applied toward your instrument rating. There are some ways you can mix and match a little bit while you're doing your instrument rating on this. If you got some questions about that, I've got a couple articles out there. But be very careful about it. Many instructors do not carefully log this during the instrument rating, and it leaves the person getting their commercial having to go get 10 hours of instrument training specific to the commercial. So make sure that's very clearly there. The 10 hours of complex time, the TAA, or in rare cases we see turbine, can be done. That is, it specifically says any combination thereof. So that can be done. You could do 5 hours in a complex. You could do 5 hours in a TA, whatever it happens to be. And that is a mix and match that you have to do. That is dual training in one of those types of airplanes. So make sure that's identifiable when you're trying to qualify an applicant. And then we have 2 specific cross-country requirements. One's a 2-hour daytime cross-country that goes at least 100 miles away, so a little bit different than 61-1. We've got to go a little further in this one. And then we also have the nighttime cross-country that's got to be done with an instructor. This is instruction received, where you're going to go out. A lot of folks do this where they'll fly somewhere, out more than 100 miles, make sure it's longer than 2 hours during the day, park the airplane, and turn around and come back. And you can make that a nice, efficient use of your commercial students training that way. And then we got the 3 hours of training within the preceding 2 calendar months. So, dig into these carefully. Make sure you're doing what the reg says, and don't try and get too creative with double dipping. If you're a CFI working with your students, you're going to give them better training that way. They're going to get better experience, and it's less likely they're going to show up to the check ride and get sent home. Examiners do poke at this pretty carefully. We are going to look at the cross countries you flew. Most of us are going to pop it into our 4-flight or Garmin pilot or whatever it happens to be and make sure that cross country is far enough to count. Pretty critical stuff because we want to make sure the things you did count also. So here's a fun example of one of these. This is a long commercial cross country. And if we go back to the regs, I'm going to go back one slide for a sec. It says a commercial cross country not less than 300 miles total distance. That's total. Landings at 3 points. One's a straight line distance of at least 250 miles. Now, it does not say a leg of 250 miles. It says a landing point that's at least 250. A lot of folks mix that up thinking you have to be in the air for more than 250 miles. If you're flying a slow plane, a Champ or a Cub, you want to build that flight time and you need gas or you need a bio break, that's fine. You can stop. But you do have to have a point that's more than 250 miles away from where you started. So in this case, if we started at Hot Springs and then we took a ride up there, we got 100 or an 80-mile leg to start. We got another 94-mile leg, and then our last leg home is only 145 miles. We do not have a point of landing that is more than 250 miles away. While we meet the 250 or the 300-mile total distance, we do not meet that requirement of having a landing point that's far enough away. So, you know, a nice flight to make maybe and some good experience, but in this case, this would not meet the requirement for a long commercial cross-country qualifying flight. So dig into these carefully as you're doing it. We're going to throw a couple more examples, and this one's kind of an interesting one. This one just barely counts. We used a similar kind of airport. Our first leg's only 80 miles away, then they dog-legged up, and they got a 252, and then their back leg, because of that angle, is a whopping 250.9 miles away. Whew, scary if this is your day of the check ride, and we're wondering if you're going to get to have it count. The good news is, in this case, it does count, but it was right on the edge of that one if we look at this. Throwing it even a little bit more interesting, nobody said you got to go home. So in this case, we have somebody that, you know, maybe ferried an airplane and dropped it off, or worst case, had it break somewhere. And they flew out. They went to Tulsa, JLN, and over to Jeff. So in this case, they have a landing point that is actually more than 250 miles away, but the total distance is just barely more than the 300. So best message I can give you here, and if you go digging through my blog, you'll find a not too long ago case where we had one of these on a commercial check ride end up, and I think it was like 0.37 miles short of counting for the 250. Super frustrating. We actually had to dig down into the airport reference point to figure out the exact latitude and longitude of that airport to see if we could make it count. That poor student had to refly it, and the good news is she got it done and is now a commercial pilot. But it did mean she had to go refly across country. So dig into these carefully. Don't cut the corners with your students. Make sure that those cross countries are going to meet the requirements. And if there's a question of whether an airport meets it, just pick another airport 15 or 20 miles away and make sure you get there. If we look at this, we're talking about these 10 hours of instrument training. I kind of highlighted this a little bit ago. It does not necessarily mean it counts if you have an instrument rating. And we're going to dig into this in a really good scenario. So the gist is that an instrument rating doesn't necessarily meet the requirements. The student needs specific log training, so 6129, that is dual received. It has to be by a CFII. This cannot be a standard CFI or a sport pilot CFI doing these, so it's got to be a CFI. It's one of the limitations on the CFI certificate. If you do not have an instrument CFI certificate, notice we said earlier that it had to be with a view-limiting device. So doing this in actual IFR conditions without the view-limiting device, while certainly great experience, isn't going to meet that requirements. And about 5 hours or up to 5 hours of it can be in a simulator if you have one available that is a certificate or certified sim. So let's look at a couple examples here. The commercial. So we got a student. He's got 48 hours of instrument experience, 3 hours from a CFI in their private. So that one's not going to help us towards it, right? 45 hours doing the CFII, and they logged all that training as instrument rating training. This is something we see regularly. Now, instead, if somebody was really savvy, we might see that they had 48 hours of instrument training. They had 3 hours from the CFI during the private, still not helping. But during their instrument, that CFII logged 25 of it towards their instrument ASEL requirements. So that instrument rating requires 40 hours of total experience time, but only 15 of it has to be specifically toward the instrument rating. So if they're careful while they do it, they might choose to break some of those flights out and do some of those required items and log 10 hours of it toward the commercial certificate. So this takes a little bit of work and it's a little bit savvy, but if this is how we did it with the exact same experience stuff going on, the guy on the left with his paperwork is going to not proceed to a check ride, but the guy on the right is going to get that check ride done. So sometimes making sure you do that work the right way as the instructor is really critical in helping your student for the long run also. I got another experience one for you. So this one's a real world. We'll call him Blake because that's his name. So he had about 750 hours of flight experience, 198 of total instrument time. Bunch of that was in actual IFR, 113 of it. He'd received 37 hours of dual training from a CFII in actual IMC conditions, 45 from a CFII logs towards his instrument rating, and then he had the 3 in the private. So this begs the question then, does he need, if he's going to go get his commercial, any additional training to get to that? Now, the challenge is what we're showing here is that 45 in the beginning was toward the instrument rating, so they had not logged it that way. He's got a bunch of actual IMC experience, but 37 of that was dual is in IMC conditions without a view limiting device. So in this case, he was not eligible for the practical test until he did a few more things. He had to get a little bit more training to be eligible for it. In this case, he needed the 10 hours of experience with a view limiting device towards the commercial. What we did with him is he did 5 in an airplane, and then he actually sat in a simulator and did 5 there to kind of check the box and get it done. Is this a little bit perfunctory in this case? Yes, kind of. I mean, the reality is he's certainly got experience that would apply to this, but we do have to meet that documentary requirement for the training. We are trying to work through a little change on this. What I'd like to see happen is that regulation be changed and simply read or be the holder of an instrument rating, and we would take this whole question out and make it a little bit easier and less confusing. It is something we're trying to work on from a regulatory standpoint, but as things with government, they do take time, and as it goes forward, we'll try and fix it for folks. But in the meantime, be aware of this one so you get it correct. I highlighted this a little while ago, the 6211 requirements. This is important for all of the ratings or certificates, that they do have to have a point of landing that's at least 50 miles away from the point of origin. Pretty critical piece to make sure those cross countries count. 50 hours PIC. So a couple common ones we're running into. We sometimes see people counting to get that instrument rating and the commercial rating, that 50 PIC, right on the edge of the 50 cross-country time, and they forget that the solo time in their private it does count. I got this backwards on here. The solo time in the private does count, but the dual time in their private, they're not acting as PIC during that portion of it. So make sure that if you are kind of cutting your students close on that cross-country time for the commercial and instrument certificates, that cross-country time is PIC cross-country time. And then again, we commonly see people not fly far enough on their cross-country flights to count for cross-country time. Bump it over here. I'm bringing this up for folks just for kind of a highlight. We're actually seeing this come up somewhat regularly when we have applicants who are living outside of the United States. Now, I say this doesn't mean a non-U.S. student. It could be. It also could be a U.S. student or pilot who is receiving training and doing an application in IACRA who lives outside the U.S. So if we have an individual that, say, lives in Switzerland and they put that on their IACRA form as their residence, and we push through the application, you get a cool letter back, and this is a screenshot from mine. I took the guy's name out of it, but he had a name outside the U.S., an address. And as a matter of fact, in this case, he actually had a mailing address additionally that was in the U.S. So what has happened is the FAA is no longer sending pilot certification information outside of the country. They have to send it to a U.S. state or territory or military base as the address. Stuff was getting lost in the mail overseas. Things weren't getting to them. And there's also a pretty significant cost for that. So the FAA is asking folks, if you want to be a pilot certificate holder and you're doing certification events, you must register with the USAS, U.S. Agent of Service must be registered where it will receive the mail for you somewhere here in the U.S. If the person has not registered for that, their application is going to come back to us. So as you're working with students out there in the field, make sure that that residential address, if it's not a U.S. one, the examiner is going to ask that applicant, have you completed the USAS registration? And if they have not done so, that's something that's going to have to be done. So if you got students like that, I know it's not super common, but it does happen once in a while. Make sure we get ahead of that or give the examiner a little heads up. So I'm trying to keep this kind of to the lunch hour period. I know it's 1 o'clock, but 12 o'clock Central and across the country. I'm going to throw a couple other scenarios out here for folks and then open it up to some questions, some interaction if anybody has it. And I will tell you, I love these scenarios that pop up because a lot of times examiners, we ping each other and send each other texts and questions and go, hey, have you seen this? What do you think? And we all try and solve stuff because sometimes there's some pretty quirky stuff. So I'll open this up to the folks for a minute. One of the questions I got, my question is, could I combine the commercial 250-mile cross-country with an instrument cross-country and log that flight towards both the instrument and the commercial? So do one cross-country, make sure it's 300 plus miles, and do it instruments and call it good. Anybody want to jump into the chat or even open up? What's anybody think on this? Quiet. I'll start picking on people soon. So I've got another Steve. I saw you just came off voice here. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm almost positive that's the way we did this. You can do that 250 because you don't have to land back where you're at. So you can do the 250. Wait a minute, let me think about this. And then I think that's how we did it. We don't have to land all the way back, and then as long as you're 50 miles away, you can do a separate instrument cross country on the way back.
Okay, so what you're highlighting here is a different potential solution to it, right? So can I fly out 300 miles, do my instrument cross country, terminate that flight, and then fly back and have a separate commercial cross country?
I'm almost positive that's how I did it, yeah.
Yep, you can do that. Now, could I do one 300-mile flight and have it count for both?
I'd say no.
Yep, you're correct. So this is where the double dipping gets hard. Folks don't understand sometimes that you can sequence requirements, right? Making sure each one meets the requirement, but you can't double dip and just use one for both. So I couldn't just fly a 300-mile cross-country IFR under the hood and have it count for both of them, right? Does that make sense? So good question there. Thanks for coming in on that one. Let's go to another one. How about, can I count my instrument time in the private pilot that's in excess of the 3 hours toward the instrument rating? Anybody want to jump in on this? George, Pavey, go for it.
Gary here. Yeah,
there you go.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, this was kicked around years and years ago, and I, at the time, my apologies for kind of hedging my comment, but we thought we were not permitted to do that, to kind of double dip.
So I think the answer here becomes, it depends, right? So what if I have an excess of 3 hours of instrument time? I did 5, 6, 8 hours, something like that during my private. I need 3 towards the private certificate. I need 40 towards the instrument. I need 15 specifically toward the instrument rating. And the reason I say it depends is you'd have to go back and see what kind of instructor was it that was giving that training. If it was a straight CFI, they cannot give training towards the instrument or commercial rating. If they're a CFII, the excess time could, if properly logged separately as not towards the private pilot certificate, but towards the future, be used for future instrument total experience time. So Gary, I see your hand up. Jump on in. These are great discussions.
Yes, sir. So what we had kicked around years and years ago was the idea of having sort of in the Navy model. The Navy model basically for student aviators is we do their instrument first,
right?
Essentially. And so we thought to myself, oh, gee, how clever that would be. Would it be possible to maybe just have that a non-certificated student pilot, non-private pilot, actually accrue training towards their instrument while they're a private pilot? And I think, again, sir, I think the answer we came back there was the FAA wouldn't like that.
Yep. Now we do have out there a few programs that do a concurrent private and instrument, and in some cases it is a single check ride for both, one big long check ride in the same day. So there's some methodology for that, but it's very tough. And this is, again, one of those double dipping things where you got to make sure, the CFI is properly, trained, properly certificated, and that you're not trying to double dip that flight time, if that makes sense for everybody. So I'll throw one more up here. So if the student did their long cross-country flight for their private certificate and had the time, I also endorse them to do their long cross-country flight, that would count towards their commercial. Do they have to have their private pilot certificate first done to do the other experience requirements? I'm going to pick on Eric. You on here? Eric Rivera? Can we get him off mute? Eric's another examiner. Okay, I don't know if he's coming off mute or not. Samantha, go ahead. Help us out here. Come off mute for us. I see you're still muted, but your hand's up.
Jason, this is Pat. Everybody should be able to speak.
Yep.
I'm here. You hear me now?
Yeah, I gotcha.
Oh, okay.
So, Eric, are you taking this one? What do you think as another examiner?
Yeah, I believe you can. We had this conversation actually a week ago or so, where I had an instructor who approached me saying, "Hey, I have my student who did his commercial pilot certificate before he did his instrument. He was in between. He has some time left, and I have some examiners who are saying that that's not possible." And I said, well, he doesn't need his instrument ready for the commercial certificate, so that will be possible. And so I believe this scenario right here is similar.
I agree with you. Matter of fact, you might be exactly where this question came from. So the question here is, can somebody do other experience requirements while they're solo? Yes, they certainly can. It couldn't be the same flight. So you couldn't just send the student far enough to make it count for a commercial and have that exact flight count for the private pilot. There would have to be two separate events. But you could endorse a student as a CFI to do a flight long enough while they're a student pilot, while they're pursuing their private, to have it additionally count for their future commercial certificate. Separate events, but every once in a while you'll see things like this happen, and it can be done. So sometimes we do see some creative things happen, but when you're going to do these, you got to be really careful with them. And the best advice I still come back to is always do what the regulation says. The more creative you get, the more challenging it's going to be to document that. And if you have things like this you're trying to do, reach out to the examiner even before you send the student on the check ride if it's in question, even sometimes before you send them on that particular potentially qualifying activity, because we want to make sure that we're not wasting folks' time. Chase, I see your hand up there.
Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
I gotcha.
All right. Question that we kicked around a while ago. The word from the origin airport in your cross countries. So
Yep.
even pick the private pilot, 3 legs.
Yep.
So that more than 50 nautical miles, as it was originally explained to me in a way, was draw a circle around your airport that's 50 nautical miles. And so long as your first or last, landing point is outside of that, you're going to be okay.
So I'm going to go back to the example we had in here. This is a great question. If the student started at Florence, flew to Woodward and Lumberton and back, it doesn't count. If the student was given a solo endorsement from Florence to Woodward, and that was one line in their logbook, and then they say they had a separate endorsement to fly from Woodward to Lumberton to Florence and back to Woodward, and log that as a separate line, and then had another endorsement to fly across country from Woodward back to Florence. We have 3 different flights. The first and the last one don't do much for us, but the middle one would actually meet that requirement. So, finding a point that is from your original point. Now, you can pick that original point. You might fly to somewhere else to have that be your point of origin. It's probably the least efficient way to do it? And the answer is probably simpler to just pick a spot, in this case from Florence, that's more than 50 miles away from your starting point, right? Something outside that 50-mile circle, and make a landing to make it count as that cross country. If that makes it clear. Chase, is that what you guys came up with as you kind of worked it through?
Well, the question came up with, does that third leg count? So say you had, so long as that third leg is more than 51 nautical miles and you're landing at home, so the last leg is the 51 nautical miles.
So it does not say in the regulation that your first point of landing must be more than 50 miles away. It says a point of landing. So you could fly a first leg that's 20 miles away, another 20-mile leg, another 30-mile leg, but as long as one of your landing points is more than 50 miles from the point of origin, it's going to meet that requirement. Now, make sure you're still in the private. It does say a leg of greater than 50 miles. So unlike the commercial that says a landing point of more than 250 miles away, the commercial specifically says there is a leg that has to be at least 50 miles in length, which means the student's got to be physically in an airplane flying for more than 50 miles. So if you got that 65 knot headwind like I had yesterday when I was flying, and you're in a champ, you might need to stop and it's not going to work. So pick a day where you're going to be able to make more than 50 miles of flying with a landing to make sure it counts. Good question. So I'm going to kind of throw this slide up. Anybody have other discussion, questions? We're open for a little while here. I can jump back to any of these slides if you want. Does anybody have some things they want to jump in with? Certainly open to discussion here. Appreciate everybody listening in over kind of the late lunch hour in the Eastern time, early lunch hour, if you're catching this all the way out west. And again, I'm going to have this recorded for us, some stuff we can share with folks to get people thinking. Share this with other instructors if you can to help them. And always, always reach out to the examiner or more senior instructors that can help you if you have questions about whether or not your student's qualifying event is going to count for that experience requirement that they're trying to satisfy. Moving the cat for everybody.
Jason, Gary Parker here.
Thanks. What do you got?
Yes, sir. So just seeing your software there made me wonder as I get back into teaching at the Part 61, maybe 141 level. I teach at 121 world right now. What about using of just conventional old paper charts? A related subject.
And I'll tell you, we had an experience. This was a number of years ago. It was out at, I can't remember the exact airports, but it was an instructor out in Nashua, New Hampshire area that they actually had an airport that they were using with students for a long time. It was like 50.5 miles away. They'd send them out, cross country, come back. And then the airport got a refurb. And the airport reference point changed to 49.9 miles away. And it no longer counted as a cross country. And they caught it a little late, and the FAA was great about it and said, oh my God, nobody caught this, just stop doing it, right? So we have great software now that can tell us down to the 10th. I will tell you, for flight rounds up or down to the mile from the 0.5. So if it's, 249.6, it's going to call it 250. iFlight Planner goes to the 10th. If you have to really find the detail, this is where I had to go not long ago and dig into the actual airport reference point in the chart supplement and put it into a GPS plotter. And I think we came up with 249.63 miles for the cross country on a commercial, which made it not count. If you're measuring, using old school paper, can you get down to the 10th? No, make sure it's more than 250, right? So you got to give the examiner something to hang their hat on. And when I say the examiner, I mean the potential civil lawsuit later, that if you showed this in court and said, here's my plotter and here's the points, does a reasonable person say that's greater than 250 miles? We do have great software we can use for this now to make sure. And again, I'll always say, if you think it's in question, just pick one that's 260 to make it easier. So, but paper is great if you can show it and make sure.
Great. Thanks a lot, sir.
I'll add a small caveat to that if I could.
Please.
ForeFlight does not go to the decimal, so be cautious.
Right. It rounds up or down to the full mile. Yep.
I had a student rejected for 0.2 on ForeFlight. Yeah.
Yep. Super frustrating. Anybody else got stuff you want to jump in with here?
Also, real quick on that ForeFlight discrepancy, I use ForeFlight mobile and web to finish my commercial, and both of them said I wasn't eligible because there's some kind of bug in there. They both had different things that I didn't complete. So yeah, like the web says I need the 300 nautical mile cross country, but I had a bunch of qualifying flights that fit that. And the mobile had a different requirement that I didn't have. So just reminding students that that report in there is not accurate.
That is a really good point, and that goes to the private, the instrument, the commercial, all of them. I will tell you, if you show up with the report in ForeFlight, I will look at it, and it gives me a hint that we're probably headed the right direction. But we are, as the examiner, going to look at the specific logged events then. And there are times that I've seen it exactly like you said, say they're not eligible, and they are. And I've seen times where it says they are eligible and they're not. A couple of things we run into in that is it will aggregate instrument experience. It doesn't necessarily know what was logged towards a private, towards an instrument, towards a commercial. It's just going to get total times. And these are challenges of all of the logbook softwares that are trying to apply the regulation and qualification. And, it's not a perfect science by any means. When it comes to that, if you're getting ready for the test, one of the best advices I can give you is have the report. Sure, have an actual logbook if you still keep one. If not, all of the software systems that I know of, you can go into and print a report of your specific flight training activities and events and the actual logbook. I mean, you can actually export these to like a logbook and print it. That's going to make it easier for your examiner. If you really want to be savvy, do that a few days ahead and email the PDF to your examiner or tab the stuff out. Make it easier for us to qualify you as ready. Sit down a couple days ahead with a CFI and the applicant and go through stuff. And when I see people do this, I mean, I literally can walk into some places and qualify the applicant in a few minutes instead of having to play the hunt and find game, which sometimes can take, minutes, hours, and generate we're just flat out of time to do the test. Even though we think they might be qualified for the test, we have to find that documentation. So don't just trust the software. Just, make sure you dig into that and have a way to show all of it. And I will also tell you at some point, if you're going to an airline or a professional flying career, they're going to probably want to see that printed out at some point too. So get used to doing that. It's also a great way to have a backup in case you ever have a system problem with the software or it collapses or fails or anything like that. This is your career with your logbook. Make sure you got a good backup of it. I've seen a couple horror stories on that, and it can be pretty darn tough when you're trying to document this stuff.
Hey, Jason.
Yes, please.
I had this conversation with a CFI that works at ForeFlight, and his encouragement about ForeFlight, actually, it does go to a decimal, but you will have to go to the logbook functionality
to find it.
And then you have to go enter the departure and destination.
Got it.
It will be under a distance entry, I think it is, in the cross country.
Okay.
And he actually says there, I tried it on a plotter, on a paper map, and then I did it on ForeFlight. It gave me the same.
So for a flight that you flew and logged, is what you're saying, it will actually give you that detail down to the 10th?
Yeah, if you put that on the logbook on cross country.
Cool.
Time,
good tip.
distance.
Good tip.
Yeah, and sir, this is Nicholas Tupper. I'll jump in a little bit additionally. If you do the 2-finger press and hold thing on ForeFlight, that variant of the plotter does also have decimals. So if you want to just get a measure using that. Another thing in the ForeFlight logbook, if you, a lot of people don't make good use of this, you can add custom fields.
Yes.
So I have a number of custom fields with a specific regulatory citation.
Yep.
So they can log time by that citation on every flight.
And that's a great example. If you do happen, like in the commercial, to be choosing to do it as DPIC time, you might make exactly that, a special column that you could find a field for that and be able to document it that way. Great tip also. I will say a lot of folks just don't get into their logbook in real good detail in digital. I mean, if you're going to use it, use the source that's there and use all the resources that are in there because you can have some fantastic logging. I mean, I have a spreadsheet because I'm a little old school, and I just haven't converted it, but I have lots of specialty columns for stuff that help me personally find some of my own flight experience stuff.
And don't forget ForeFlight and most other online logbook functions will allow you to automatically export an Excel spreadsheet. So I get a backup once a month from ForeFlight.
Yep, agreed. Good stuff. And for folks that if you are still doing actual, paper logbooks, I mean, I always give folks the tip, if you go into, and I know the iPhone has this and just the Notes app, you can take a picture and turn it into a PDF, have backups of your logbooks, your flight reviews, your IPCs, all of your endorsements. If the dog chews on it, the house burns down, anything like that, you don't want that to be the thing that holds your career up. Have backups of this stuff if you ever do need to reproduce it. It's not ideal, but at least you have something to hang your hat on then too. So. Anybody else have stuff they want to jump in with? If not, you're always welcome to reach me offline, email, text message, whatever. If I'm not in the air, I will certainly answer and get back to you. Sometimes it takes me, Dave, if we're in busy flying season. This time of the year, I get a little more time because we get this Michigan stuff. So appreciate everybody jumping in and listening today, and I'll open it up for any last ones. Otherwise, we'll get closing out here today. I'll take silence as a opportunity to close out here. Appreciate everybody joining us. When I do share this out, share it with everybody, and certainly help us spread the FAA safety team events like this. We do get some folks that come in, but we also want to get more CFIs regularly engaged because that makes all of our training better. And as the picture here says, the goal is not just to produce pilot certificate holders. We want to produce good airmen, good pilots out there. So appreciate you guys being willing to be part of that process today by jumping on to this seminar also. Thanks everybody for joining in.